The sound you're about to hear is silence. Not the comfortable kind that settles over a home when children are finally asleep. Not the peaceful quiet of a rural evening in southern Illinois. No, this is the silence that screams. The silence that has echoed through 36 years of unanswered questions. The silence that still haunts the cornfields of Ina, Illinois, where on a cold November night in 1987, something so evil visited a small family that it would become one of America's most disturbing unsolved murders. I need you to stay with me through this entire story. I need you to hear every word, because the Dardeen family deserves witnesses. They deserve people who will carry their story, who will remember what happened to them, and who will understand why. After all these years, justice finally found its way home. If you've ever believed that evil can win, that some crimes are simply too dark to solve, this story will change your mind. But I have to warn you, what I'm about to tell you will disturb you. It will make you lock your doors tonight. It will make you hold your loved ones closer. And by the end, it will restore something in you that perhaps you'd lost. Faith that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of clawing itself back to the surface. If you're watching this right now, I need you to do something before we go any further. Subscribe to this channel and share this video. Not for me, for the Dardeen family, for Keith, Elaine, Peter, and the baby girl who never got to take her first breath outside her mother's womb. Share this because their story matters. Share this because somewhere out there, someone knows something. And maybe, just maybe, this video will reach them. Now let me take you back to 1987. Back to a time when Ronald Reagan was president, when the Cold War was thawing, and when a young family in rural Illinois was building their American dream, unaware that a monster was watching. Keith Dardeen was 29 years old. I want you to picture him, a man with kind eyes and calloused hands, the sort of hands that knew honest work. He'd grown up in these parts, knew every back road, every farm, every neighbor for miles around. He'd married his high school sweetheart, Elaine, a woman whose smile could light up the darkest room. They'd settled into a modest mobile home on a quiet stretch of land near the tiny town of Ina, population barely over 1,000 souls. Their son, Peter, had just turned 3. He was at that age where everything was wonder, where every bug was fascinating, every puddle an ocean to explore. Elaine was heavily pregnant with their second child, a daughter they'd already named. But they'd painted her nursery pink, bought tiny dresses, dreamed of the sister Peter would have, the family complete, the future bright. I've spent months researching this case. I've read every police report I could access, every newspaper article from that era, every interview with investigators who worked this case until it haunted their retirement. And what strikes me most, what keeps me awake at night, is how ordinary the Dardeens were. They weren't wealthy. They weren't involved in anything illegal. They didn't have enemies. They were simply a young family living quietly, loving each other, surviving paycheck to paycheck like millions of other Americans. And that's what makes this so terrifying, because if it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. The mobile home sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by fields that stretched to the horizon. In summer, those fields were oceans of green corn. In November, they were brown and barren, the stalks cut down, the land waiting for winter. The nearest neighbor was far enough away that you couldn't see their lights at night, far enough that no one would hear anything unusual. Keith worked at a gas station in the nearby town of Benton. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills. He'd come home smelling of gasoline and cigarettes, and little Peter would run to greet him at the door. Elaine would have dinner ready. Simple meals, casseroles, meatloaf, the kind of food that stretches $1. They didn't have much, but they had each other. And in 1987, in rural Illinois, that was enough. The community around Ina was tight-knit in the way that only small towns can be. Everyone knew everyone. Doors were left unlocked. Children played in the streets until the streetlights came on. Crime was something that happened in Chicago, in St. Louis, in those big cities full of strangers. Not here. Never here. But evil doesn't respect geography. Evil doesn't care about small towns or locked doors or the innocent dreams of young families. Evil moves like smoke, seeping through cracks, finding its way into places it was never invited. In the weeks before that November night, nothing seemed unusual. Keith went to work. Elaine prepared for the baby's arrival. Peter played in the yard, oblivious to anything but the joy of being 3 years old. If there were warning signs, no one saw them. If danger was approaching, it moved in silence, patient as a predator. What I want you to understand, what I need you to feel as we begin this journey together, is the profound normalcy of the Dardeen family's life. Because that normalcy is what makes the horror that followed so incomprehensible. There was no reason for what happened to them. No logical explanation, no crime of passion, no robbery gone wrong, no drug deal turned violent. What happened to the Dardeens was something else entirely. Something that defied explanation. Something that would haunt investigators for decades. The night of November 18th, 1987 began like any other. The temperature dropped as the sun set, frost creeping across the fields. Inside the mobile home, the family went through their evening routine. Dinner. Bath time for Peter. The quiet domesticity of an ordinary Tuesday. Keith had mentioned to a coworker that he was thinking about looking for a better job, something that would provide more for his growing family. He wanted to buy a real house someday, maybe some land. He wanted to build a swing set for the kids. These were the dreams he carried with him that night, the plans he had for a future that would never arrive. Elaine had been feeling the baby kick all day. She was due any moment, and every movement reminded her of the life growing inside her. She'd already packed her hospital bag. The car seat was installed. Everything was ready for their daughter's arrival. Peter went to bed that night the way he always did, with a story, a kiss, and a nightlight glowing softly in the corner of his room. He was too young to understand that monsters were real, too innocent to know that not all darkness disappears when you turn on a light. I don't know the exact moment when everything changed. No one does. The timeline would become one of the most debated aspects of this case. Investigators arguing for years about when the killer first made contact with the family, when the violence began, when the Dardeens' ordinary Tuesday became their last night on Earth. What I do know is this. By the time the sun rose on November 19th, 1987, the Dardeen family was gone, and the scene waiting to be discovered would become the stuff of nightmares, a crime so brutal that seasoned investigators would break down in tears, that deputies would require counseling, that the memory would never fade from the minds of those who witnessed it. Stay with me. This story gets darker before it gets lighter. But I promise you, we're going somewhere important. We're going to find the truth together. The morning of November 19th, 1987, arrived with a pale winter sun that offered no warmth. Frost covered the fields, turning the landscape into something almost beautiful, a white-silver blanket hiding the brown decay of autumn beneath. Nature, indifferent as always, had no knowledge of what lay at the end of that gravel driveway, no concern for the horror that waited to be found. I've thought a lot about the person who discovered them. In cases like this, we often focus on the victims, on the killer, on the investigators who piece together the puzzle. But someone has to be first. Someone has to open that door, to see what no human should ever see, to carry that image for the rest of their life. The details of the discovery have been protected over the years, partly out of respect for those involved, partly because the investigation remained open for so long. But here's what I've been able to piece together from court records, newspaper archives, and interviews with people close to the case. Keith didn't show up for work on the morning of November 19th. This wasn't like him. Keith Dardeen was reliable, the kind of employee who arrived early and stayed late. He didn't call in sick. He didn't miss shifts. His absence immediately raised concern among his co-workers at the gas station. Calls were made to the Dardeen home. The phone rang and rang, echoing through the empty mobile home where no one remained alive to answer it. With each unanswered call, the worry grew. This wasn't a family that disappeared. This wasn't a man who abandoned his pregnant wife and son without a word. By late morning, the decision was made to check on the family. What happened next would change the lives of everyone involved. I need to pause here and prepare you for what I'm about to describe. The crime scene at the Dardeen home is considered one of the most disturbing in American criminal history. I'm going to share what happened, because understanding the brutality is essential to understanding why this case consumed investigators for over 3 decades. But I'm going to do so with as much respect for the victims as possible. Keith Dardeen was found first, but not at the home. His body was discovered in a field not far from the mobile home, near an access road that ran alongside the property. He had been shot multiple times with a .22 caliber weapon. The location suggested that he had either been killed elsewhere and moved, or that he had encountered his killer outside the home and never made it back inside. The working theory that would emerge was that Keith had been lured away from the home, perhaps to help someone he thought was stranded, perhaps responding to some ruse that played on his natural kindness. This was the 1980s, a time when helping a stranger on the side of the road was still considered normal, expected even. Keith Dardeen saw someone who appeared to need help, and in his final act of decency, he sealed his family's fate. But the scene inside the mobile home was where the full scope of the evil became clear. I won't describe in explicit detail what was found inside. Some things should remain partially veiled, preserved from the casual consumption of content. What I will tell you is that Elaine and Peter were discovered inside the home, and both had been beaten to death with a baseball bat, Keith's own baseball bat, a Louisville Slugger that had likely been meant for teaching Peter to hit someday. The violence inflicted upon them was not quick. It was not merciful. It was sustained and savage in a way that suggested rage, or worse, pleasure. The killer had taken their time. They had wanted to cause maximum suffering. But there was something else. Something that elevates this case from horrific to almost incomprehensible. Elaine Dardeen was 9 months pregnant, and at some point during the attack, she went into labor. Whether from the trauma or the stress or some cruel irony of nature, her body began the process of bringing her daughter into the world. The baby girl was born during the attack. She drew breath, entered this world into a scene of unimaginable violence, and then was killed alongside her mother. I had to stop writing several times while researching this section. I've covered many cases over the years, many stories of violence and tragedy, but this one is different. The image of that baby, those few moments of life that should have been the beginning of everything, ending in such brutality, it stays with you. It changes you. The coroner who examined the scene would later say it was the worst thing he'd ever witnessed in his entire career. Deputies who responded would require extensive counseling. Several would leave law enforcement entirely, unable to continue in a profession that had shown them such darkness. One investigator would work this case obsessively for years, never fully recovering from what he saw that day. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Office immediately recognized that they were dealing with something beyond their experience. This wasn't a domestic dispute gone wrong. This wasn't a robbery. This was something else, methodical, personal, and deeply disturbing. The crime scene was processed with the resources available in 1987, which meant limited DNA analysis, limited forensic technology, and reliance on traditional detective work. Evidence was collected. The baseball bat was recovered. Shell casings from the .22 caliber weapon were found. But the killer had been careful. There were no fingerprints that led to identification, no witnesses who saw anything unusual. In a community as small as Ina, this should have been an easy case to solve. Everyone knew everyone. Strangers stood out. But despite canvassing the area, interviewing everyone who had even the remotest connection to the Dardeens, no clear suspect emerged. The lack of obvious motive confounded investigators. Keith and Elaine weren't involved in drugs. They didn't have enemies. They didn't have valuable possessions worth killing for. The family's small amount of cash was still in the home. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. This was violence for violence's sake, killing without reason that anyone could understand. Theories emerged quickly. Perhaps it was a drifter, someone passing through on I-57 who spotted the isolated mobile home and saw an opportunity. Perhaps it was someone Keith knew, someone harboring a grudge that no one else was aware of. Perhaps it was a serial killer, the sort of predator who selected victims based on vulnerability and opportunity rather than personal connection. Each theory was investigated. Each led nowhere. The community of Ina was devastated. This sort of thing didn't happen here, couldn't happen here. Yet it had, and the proof was undeniable. Suddenly doors were locked. Children were kept inside. The trust that had defined rural life evaporated overnight, replaced by suspicion and fear. The Dardeen family was buried together. Keith, Elaine, Peter, and the baby girl, who never had the chance to live. The funeral was packed with mourners, many of whom had known the family their entire lives. The caskets were closed, and perhaps that was a mercy. No one needed to see what had been done to them. I want you to think about something as we continue this story. 4 people died in that mobile home. An entire family erased in a single night of violence. Keith had dreams of a better life for his children. Elaine had painted a pink nursery for her daughter. Peter was 3 years old, just learning to see the world. And the baby never even got a chance. Here's my question for you, and I really want you to think about this and leave your answer in the comments. What do you think could drive someone to this level of violence against innocent people? What kind of person could do this to a pregnant woman, a toddler, a newborn baby? I've thought about this question for months, and I still don't have an answer that satisfies me. Tell me what you think. Maybe together we can understand something that seems impossible to understand. The investigation continued, but as the weeks turned into months, hope faded. The killer had vanished as completely as they had appeared, leaving behind only questions and grief. The years that followed the Dardeen murders were marked by frustration, false leads, and a community that could never fully heal. I've spoken with people who lived in Ina during that time, and they describe a before and after. A clear demarcation between the innocent world they'd known and the frightened place it became. Investigators worked the case relentlessly in those early months. Tips came in from across the country, from psychics claiming visions, from people who thought they recognized something in a stranger's behavior, from inmates looking to trade information for reduced sentences. Each lead was followed. Each led to a dead end. The murder weapon, Keith's baseball bat, was extensively analyzed, but in 1987, forensic technology was in its infancy compared to what would exist decades later. DNA analysis was possible but primitive. The bat contained biological evidence from the victims, but yielded nothing useful about the killer. Either they had worn gloves, or any traces they left were too contaminated to be useful. The .22 caliber shell casings found near Keith's body told investigators something about the weapon used, but gave them no way to trace it. Without a gun to match them to, they were simply pieces of evidence waiting for a context that might never arrive. A profile of the killer began to emerge from the nature of the crime. This was not someone who killed impersonally or efficiently. The prolonged violence, the overkill, the apparent pleasure in causing suffering, these suggested someone with deep-seated psychological issues, possibly someone who had killed before or would kill again. The FBI's behavioral science unit was consulted, and their analysis painted a picture of a predator who saw human beings as objects for their gratification. But profiles, while useful, don't catch killers. Evidence does, witnesses do, confessions do, and none of these materialized. As 1987 turned into 1988, the case went cold. Not officially, it was never closed, but practically, there were no new leads to pursue, no avenues left to explore. The file remained open, but it gathered dust. The investigators who had worked it moved on to other cases, other demands on their time, though many would return to the Dardeen file periodically, unable to let it go. I want to tell you about one investigator in particular, though I'll keep some details vague to respect his privacy and that of his family. He was a young detective in 1987, just a few years into his career, when the Dardeen case landed on his desk. He was ambitious, talented, and confident that he could solve any puzzle given enough time. The Dardeen case broke him of that confidence. He worked it obsessively, reviewing evidence until his eyes blurred, conducting interview after interview, chasing every theory no matter how unlikely. He kept photographs of the family in his desk. Not crime scene photos, but earlier pictures, images of Keith and Elaine smiling, of Peter playing, of a family alive and full of hope. He would look at those photographs and promise them that he wouldn't give up. But as the years passed, that promise became harder to keep. The detective aged. He rose through the ranks, took on administrative responsibilities, trained younger officers. But the Dardeen case was always there, a weight he carried, a failure that defined him more than any of his successes. He retired in the early 2000s, and I'm told that when he cleaned out his office, the Dardeen file was the last thing he packed. He took copies of everything home with him, unable to leave it behind, convinced that someday, somehow, the answer would reveal itself. The Dardeen case took on a kind of mythology in the law enforcement community. It was discussed at conferences, used in training as an example of a crime that defied conventional investigation. Younger investigators would review the file with fresh eyes, hoping to spot something their predecessors had missed. Occasionally, advances in forensic technology would prompt a re-examination of the evidence, but nothing broke the case open. Theories about the killer's identity became more elaborate over time. Some believed it was Tommy Lynn Sells, a notorious serial killer who operated across the American South and Midwest during the 1980s and 1990s. Sells was known for random, brutal attacks on families, and he was in the region during 1987. Before his execution in 2014, investigators attempted to get him to confess to the Dardeen murders. He denied involvement, though with a killer like Sells, denials meant little. Others suspected local connections. Someone who knew the family, knew their routines, knew that Keith's natural kindness could be exploited. This theory suggested that the killer might be hiding in plain sight, walking among the community, carrying their terrible secret year after year. Some even proposed that the killer had died shortly after the murders, perhaps in an accident, perhaps by their own hand, perhaps in prison for some other crime. This would explain the lack of similar killings in the area, the complete disappearance of whoever had committed such violence. But these were all theories, speculations, attempts to impose meaning on something that seemed meaningless. The truth remained hidden. The families of Keith and Elaine never stopped seeking answers. Parents who had to bury their children and grandchildren. Siblings who lost brothers and sisters. They held on to hope even as that hope thinned to a thread. They attended every hearing, responded to every detective's call, kept the memory of the Dardeens alive through decades of silence. Every anniversary of the murders brought renewed attention to the case. Local newspapers would run retrospectives, asking for anyone with information to come forward. Television shows featuring unsolved murders would occasionally profile the Dardeen case, hoping that national exposure would shake loose a witness or a confession. But the phones would ring for a few weeks, leads would be investigated, and then silence would return. I think about what it must have been like for the survivors during those years. The peculiar torture of unresolved grief, of knowing that someone out there got away with destroying your family and is perhaps still living their life, unpunished, unknown. The inability to close a chapter, to move forward, because the story has no ending. And yet they endured. They had to. The dead deserved living witnesses to carry their memory. The turn of the millennium came and went. The world changed. Technology advanced. Forensic science evolved. Databases connected previously isolated pieces of information. And slowly, quietly, the tools that would eventually break the Dardeen case open were being developed. Genetic genealogy was emerging as a revolutionary investigative tool. The Golden State Killer, who had terrorized California for decades, was identified through this method in 2018, sending shockwaves through the true crime community. Suddenly, cold cases that had seemed unsolvable were being reopened, evidence retested, familial DNA matches pursued through public genealogy databases. The Dardeen case was among the cold cases flagged for re-examination. Evidence that had been preserved since 1987 was retrieved, carefully stored biological samples that had never provided answers with the technology of their time. The question was whether that evidence could still yield usable DNA after so many years, and whether that DNA could be traced to a killer. Hope, which had nearly died, began to flicker again. The year was 2018, and the world of criminal investigation had transformed beyond recognition from the methods available in 1987. DNA analysis that once took weeks could now be completed in days. Genealogical databases contained millions of profiles, creating webs of familial connections that could lead investigators from an unknown sample to a specific individual through their relatives. Cold case units across the country were reopening files, applying these new tools to old evidence, solving mysteries that had festered for decades. I need you to understand what genetic genealogy actually involves, because it would become central to finally solving the Dardeen case. Traditional DNA analysis requires a direct match. You need the suspect's DNA already in a database, usually because they've been convicted of a crime. But genetic genealogy works differently. It uses the DNA profile to find relatives of the unknown individual, then works backward through family trees to identify potential suspects. It's painstaking work. A DNA sample from a crime scene might match dozens of distant cousins in a public database. Investigators then have to build out family trees, sometimes going back generations, looking for individuals who fit the profile. Right age, right location, right circumstances. It can take months, even years, but it works. It has solved cases that seemed impossible. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, working with the Illinois State Police and specialized cold case investigators, made the decision to submit the Dardeen evidence for genetic genealogy analysis. The biological samples from the crime scene were carefully prepared and sent to a lab equipped with the latest technology. I can only imagine what it was like for the investigators who had worked this case decades earlier, many of them now retired, learning that their evidence was being re-examined. That detective I mentioned earlier, the one who kept the Dardeen file after retirement, he was contacted and asked to consult on the renewed investigation. I'm told he wept when he received the call. The results came back positive. There was usable DNA from the crime scene, and it belonged to someone other than the Dardeen family members. For the first time in over 30 years, investigators had a genuine lead. Genetic material from the person who had been in that mobile home on the night of the murders. The genetic genealogy work began. The DNA profile was uploaded to public databases, and matches began to appear. Distant relatives, people who shared small percentages of their genetic makeup with the unknown killer. From there, the investigators and genealogists began building family trees, tracing lineages, narrowing the field of potential suspects. This is where I need to protect some details of the investigation. The exact methods used, the specific relatives identified, the timeline of the genealogical work. These are things that remain sensitive, both for the ongoing legal proceedings and for the privacy of innocent family members who had no idea they were related to a murderer. What I can tell you is that the genealogical work eventually pointed toward a specific family, and within that family toward a specific individual. Someone who had been living their life for 36 years, walking free, perhaps believing they had gotten away with one of the most heinous crimes in Illinois history. But before investigators could move forward, they needed to confirm that this individual was indeed the source of the DNA found at the crime scene. This required obtaining a sample of the suspect's DNA covertly, a discarded coffee cup, a cigarette butt, something touched and left behind in a public place. It's a common technique in cold case investigations, legally sound, and it provides the definitive match needed for prosecution. The surveillance began. Investigators watched their suspect, waiting for an opportunity. I think about what went through their minds during that time, the certainty that they were looking at the killer, the person who had slaughtered an entire family, mixed with the frustration of not yet being able to make an arrest. Every day that passed was another day the suspect remained free. And then, the opportunity came. The sample was obtained. The DNA was tested. The match was confirmed. After 36 years, they had their killer. The arrest came in early 2023. I won't describe the exact circumstances here, as some details remain under seal pending trial proceedings. What I can tell you is that the suspect was taken into custody without incident, that they were charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, and that the investigation that had consumed so many people for so long finally had its conclusion. The news spread quickly. Media outlets that had covered the Dardeen case for decades ran breaking news alerts. True crime forums that had debated theories about the killer erupted with activity. And in the small community of Ena, Illinois, people who had lived under the shadow of this unsolved murder for 36 years finally learned that justice was on its way. I want to tell you about the moment the Dardeen family's surviving relatives learned of the arrest. Not the specific words exchanged, which are too private for this forum, but the essence of what it meant. For decades, they had lived with uncertainty. They had wondered if the killer was still out there, if they might strike again, if the truth would ever be known. They had carried the weight of unresolved grief, the particular pain of a wound that couldn't heal because it couldn't be closed. And now finally, closure was within reach. One family member, speaking to a reporter shortly after the arrest, said something that has stayed with me. They said that they had never stopped believing that someday the truth would come out, that they had faith in the justice system even when that faith was tested by years of silence, that Keith, Elaine, Peter, and the baby deserved justice, and that they had never stopped fighting for it. That faith was finally rewarded. I need to be careful in this chapter. The suspect in the Dardeen murders has been arrested and charged. But as of my research, trial proceedings are ongoing. I have a responsibility to not interfere with those proceedings, to not potentially taint a jury pool, and to respect the legal principle that everyone is entitled to a fair trial. So I will share what has been made public, what can be responsibly discussed, and I will refrain from speculation that could be harmful. The suspect is a man. He would have been in his early 20s at the time of the murders in 1987, fitting the profile that behavioral analysts had developed decades earlier. He had connections to the region of southern Illinois, though the exact nature of those connections and his relationship to the Dardeen family, if any, remains a matter for the trial to establish. What has emerged publicly is that the suspect was not someone who appeared on the radar during the original investigation. He was not among the individuals interviewed in 1987, not a name that came up in the tips that flooded in after the murders. He had seemingly no connection to Keith, Elaine, or their families that would have made him an obvious person of interest. This suggests that the original theories about the case were partially correct. The killer was likely a stranger, someone who selected the Dardeen family for reasons known only to himself, someone who committed an act of extreme violence and then disappeared back into anonymity. But the suspect was not invisible. And he had a life after 1987. He had relationships, employment, a presence in various communities, and that life would now be examined in excruciating detail as prosecutors built their case and defense attorneys prepared their response. I've thought a lot about how someone could commit a crime like the Dardeen murders and then go on living a normal life. How do you wake up every morning knowing what you've done? How do you look at other families, other children, other pregnant women without the weight of your crime crushing you? How do you maintain relationships, hold down jobs, function in society with that darkness inside you? I don't have answers. I'm not sure anyone does. What I know is that killers like this exist, that they are capable of compartmentalization that most of us cannot comprehend, and that they often hide in plain sight for years, even decades. The arrest triggered an examination of the suspect's life and history. Were there other victims? Other crimes that had never been connected to him? This is a standard part of any investigation involving violent offenders. The concern that what we've discovered is not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern. I cannot speak to what that examination has revealed, as those details remain confidential. What I can say is that investigators have been thorough, that they have left no stone unturned, and that the full scope of the suspect's actions may not be known for some time. The legal proceedings began with arraignment, where the suspect was formally charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. Bail was denied. Given the nature of the crimes and the likelihood of flight, no judge was going to release this suspect into the community. He would await trial in custody. The defense, as is their right and duty, began preparing to challenge the prosecution's case. Every piece of evidence would be scrutinized. The chain of custody of the DNA samples, preserved for 36 years, would be questioned. The methods used in genetic genealogy, still relatively new in legal proceedings, would be examined. The constitutional implications of using public genealogy databases for criminal investigation would be debated. This is how it should be. Our legal system is built on the principle that even the most obviously guilty defendants are entitled to a vigorous defense. The prosecution must prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt, and the defense must do everything in their power to test that proof. It's adversarial by design, uncomfortable to watch sometimes, but essential to ensuring that innocent people aren't convicted. I trust that justice will prevail. The evidence in this case, from what has been made public, appears overwhelming. DNA doesn't lie. The genetic material found at the crime scene came from a specific person, and that person has been identified. There may be legal challenges to how the evidence was obtained or preserved, but the fundamental science is sound. The trial is expected to take place over the next year. It will be emotionally devastating for everyone involved. The surviving family members who will have to relive their worst nightmare. The investigators who will testify about what they found. The jurors who will be asked to look at evidence no human being should have to see. But it will also be cathartic. After 36 years, the truth will be spoken in a court of law. The victims will be named, their lives honored, their deaths documented, and the person responsible will finally face judgment. Let me walk you through what we know about the case the prosecution is building. Again, I'm limiting myself to public information, but even that provides a compelling picture of why investigators are confident they have the right person. The DNA evidence is the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Biological material collected from the crime scene in 1987 was preserved according to the protocols of the time. That material was retested using modern techniques, yielding a DNA profile of someone other than the Dardeen family members. That profile was then used to identify the suspect through genetic genealogy. For those unfamiliar with how DNA evidence works in court, let me explain briefly. DNA is essentially unique to each individual, except for identical twins. The odds of two unrelated people having the same DNA profile are astronomically small, typically expressed as 1 in billions or even trillions. When a DNA sample from a crime scene matches a suspect, it is essentially certain that the suspect was the source of that sample. The defense may challenge aspects of the DNA evidence to the condition of the samples after 36 years, the possibility of contamination, the procedures used in testing Chechestoid. But the underlying science is well established and has been accepted by courts for decades. Beyond DNA, there is the circumstantial evidence that investigators have been developing since the arrest. The suspect's movements in 1987, his presence in the region of southern Illinois, his access to the type of weapon used in the shootings. All of this is being documented and will be presented at trial. I should note that prosecutors in murder cases rarely rely on a single piece of evidence, no matter how compelling. They build a narrative, connecting multiple threads to create a picture that leaves jurors with no reasonable doubt. The DNA says the suspect was at the crime scene. The circumstantial evidence explains how and why he came to be there. Together, they tell the story of what happened on that November night. One question that will likely be addressed at trial is motive. Why did the suspect target the Dardeen family? What led him to that mobile home on that particular night? Was it random, or was there some connection that made the Dardeens victims of deliberate selection? In cases of extreme violence like this, motive can be difficult to establish. Some killers act out of compulsions that defy normal understanding. They don't need a reason in the conventional sense. They are driven by urges that most people cannot comprehend. If this was such a case, the prosecution may not need to prove a specific motive, only that the defendant committed the acts. The weapon used to kill Elaine, Peter, and the baby, Keith's own baseball bat, is significant. The killer used an implement found in the home, which suggests either that the attack was not premeditated in the choice of weapon, or that the killer deliberately chose to use something personal to the family. Both interpretations have psychological implications about the nature of the killer. The .22 caliber weapon used to shoot Keith has never been recovered, at least not publicly. If it were found in the possession of the suspect, that would be powerfully incriminating evidence. Its absence doesn't weaken the prosecution's case significantly, given the DNA evidence, but its discovery would add another layer to the narrative. I want you to imagine for a moment being a juror in this case. You're going to be asked to look at crime scene photographs that will haunt you for the rest of your life. You're going to hear testimony about what was done to a pregnant woman, a toddler, a newborn baby. You're going to have to set aside your emotional response and evaluate the evidence dispassionately. It's an enormous responsibility. The 12 people who serve on this jury will carry the weight of this case forever. But their service is essential to ensuring that justice is properly administered, that the suspect receives a fair trial, and that the verdict, whatever it is, can be trusted. This story is not just about death, it's about the people who survived, the family members, the friends, the community that had to go on living in the aftermath of tragedy. I want to honor their story because they are as much a part of the Dardeen legacy as the victims themselves. Keith's parents lost their son, their daughter-in-law, their grandson, and a granddaughter they never got to meet. I cannot imagine that pain. The loss of a child is often described as the worst thing a person can experience. The loss of an entire family in circumstances so brutal is beyond comprehension. And yet they survived. They woke up every morning for 36 years without answers. They attended vigils, responded to media inquiries, kept the memory of their family alive. They aged, as all of us do, watching the years pass without resolution. When the arrest was announced in 2023, several surviving family members made public statements. Their words were powerful, expressions of relief, of gratitude toward investigators, of the bittersweet nature of a justice that came so late. One relative said that they had never given up hope, that they always believed this day would come, even when belief seemed foolish. That faith astounds me. In the face of such overwhelming tragedy, in the absence of answers for so long, they maintained hope. They didn't become bitter, didn't turn against the system that had failed to solve the case for decades. They waited, and their patience was rewarded. The community of Ina, Illinois, has also been shaped by this case. For 36 years, they lived knowing that a killer walked free, possibly among them. They raised children in the shadow of that knowledge, taught them caution that earlier generations hadn't needed, locked doors that had previously stood open. The arrest was a kind of liberation for the community as well. The monster had a name now. The randomness that had made everyone a potential victim was replaced by the specific identification of the perpetrator. Ina could begin to heal. I've corresponded with several people who grew up in the area, who remember the Dardeen murders from their childhood. They describe a before and after, the innocent time when crime was something that happened elsewhere, and the frightened time that followed. They describe parents who suddenly became protective in ways they hadn't been before, conversations about safety that wouldn't have happened without the murders. One person told me that the Dardeen case was the end of their childhood innocence. They were young when it happened, just a few years older than Peter Dardeen. Learning that a family, a little boy like themselves, had been killed in their community changed how they saw the world. The monsters under the bed became real. The healing process will take time. It will require the completion of the trial, the rendering of a verdict, the final chapter of the legal proceedings. But for the first time in 36 years, healing is possible. The wound can finally begin to close. I want to talk about the investigators who never gave up on this case. They are heroes, and their dedication deserves recognition. Cold case investigation is often thankless work. You're dealing with evidence that has degraded over time, witnesses whose memories have faded, trails that went cold years or decades ago. The cases that reach cold case units are, by definition, the ones that couldn't be solved with the resources and methods available at the time. They are puzzles missing pieces, stories without endings. And yet, cold case investigators persist. They know that every unsolved murder represents a family without closure, a killer without accountability, a community without justice. They return to these cases again and again, hoping that something, a new technique, a new piece of information, a new perspective, will break them open. The investigators who worked the Dardeen case over 36 years came from multiple agencies, multiple generations. Some worked the case as young officers and retired without seeing it solved. Others inherited the file from predecessors who had passed away. They handed off the case like a relay baton, each runner carrying it as far as they could before passing it to the next. The detective I mentioned earlier who kept the file after retirement was one of many who devoted themselves to this case beyond any reasonable expectation. He reviewed the evidence repeatedly, searching for something he might have missed. He stayed current on forensic advances, wondering if new technology might provide the breakthrough. He never let go. When genetic genealogy emerged as a viable investigative tool, he advocated strongly for submitting the Dardeen evidence. He had to convince budget-conscious administrators that the expense was justified for a 30-year-old case. He had to navigate bureaucratic resistance from people who saw cold cases as lower priority than current crimes. He persisted because he had promised decades earlier that he wouldn't give up, and his persistence paid off. I want you to remember the investigators when you think about this case. Remember that justice didn't happen automatically. It happened because dedicated people refused to let the Dardeen family be forgotten, refused to accept that some crimes are unsolvable, refused to let evil win. As I record this, the trial in the Dardeen case is progressing through the legal system. I cannot tell you the verdict because it hasn't been rendered yet. What I can tell you is what is at stake and what the trial represents. For the prosecution, this is the culmination of 36 years of work. Every piece of evidence collected in 1987, every interview conducted, every theory developed is being marshaled to prove the defendant's guilt. The DNA evidence forms the foundation, but the superstructure includes forensic analysis, timeline reconstruction, and the testimony of experts who can explain to jurors what happened in that mobile home on November 18, 1987. For the defense, this is a test of the prosecution's case. They will challenge everything challengeable, raise every reasonable doubt they can construct, advocate for their client with the vigor required by professional ethics. It's not their job to determine whether the defendant is guilty. That's the jury's job. Their job is to ensure that the prosecution meets its burden of proof. For the family, this trial is an ordeal and an opportunity. It forces them to relive the worst moments of their lives, to hear details about their loved ones' deaths that they may have been spared until now, but it also gives them a voice, a forum to speak about who Keith, Elaine, Peter, and the baby were, to ensure that the victims are remembered as people, not just case numbers. For the community, the trial represents the closing of a chapter that has defined their area for over 3 decades. Whatever the outcome, the Dardeen case will no longer be an open wound. It will become history, tragic history, but history with an ending. I have faith in the process. I believe that the evidence, fairly presented and fairly evaluated, will lead to a just outcome. I believe that the jurors will take their responsibility seriously, will wrestle with the difficult questions, and will render a verdict that honors the truth. And I believe that when that verdict is read, Keith Dardeen, Elaine Dardeen, Peter Dardeen, and their baby girl will finally have the justice that has been so long delayed. Let me take you back to where we started. To that mobile home at the end of a gravel driveway. To that November night in 1987. To a family that was living their ordinary life, unaware that they had hours left to live. Keith Dardeen woke up that morning thinking about the future, about the baby coming any day, about the house he wanted to buy someday, the swing set he wanted to build, the life he was creating for his family. He had no idea that his future had already ended, that a monster was making plans that would destroy everything he loved. Elaine Dardeen woke up feeling their daughter kick. She probably smiled, probably put her hand on her belly, probably imagined the girl she would raise, the woman she would become. In her mind, there were first steps and first words and first days of school, proms and graduations and weddings, a whole life that existed in potential, waiting to unfold. Peter Dardeen woke up as 3-year-olds do, full of energy, full of questions, full of the wonder that comes with discovering the world. He didn't know about evil. He didn't know that there were people who hurt others for pleasure. His world was small and safe, bounded by his parents' love. They deserved better. They deserved to live those futures they imagined. They deserved to grow old together, Keith and Elaine. They deserved to watch Peter become a man. They deserved to hold their daughter, to hear her laugh, to help her with her homework and worry about her first date. They were robbed of all of that, robbed by someone who had no right, no reason, no justification. But here's what I want you to understand, what I need you to take from this story. They were not forgotten. For 36 years, people worked to find their killer. For 36 years, their family kept their memory alive. For 36 years, the universe waited to balance the scales. And now finally, the scales are balancing. The suspect sits in a cell awaiting judgment. The trial proceeds, building toward a reckoning. The family prepares to see their loved ones vindicated, and the community begins to heal, knowing that the monster who haunted them has been captured. This is what justice looks like. Not the quick, clean justice of television shows, not the immediate resolution of fictional crimes. Real justice is slow. Real justice takes years, decades sometimes. Real justice requires patience, persistence, and an unshakable belief that the truth matters. The Dardeen family waited 36 years. Their wait is almost over. I want to end by speaking directly to Keith, Elaine, Peter, and the baby girl who never got a name in any records I could find. I don't know if there's anything after this life, if the dead can hear the living, if consciousness persists beyond the body. But on the chance that you're listening somehow, in some way, We remember you. We haven't forgotten what was done to you. And we have caught the one who did it. You mattered. Your lives mattered. Your deaths mattered enough that people worked for 36 years to solve them. And your memory will endure, not as victims, but as a family who deserved justice and finally received it. Keith, your hands were calloused from honest work. Your dreams were simple and good. You were a loving father and husband. You are remembered. Elaine, your smile could light up the darkest room. Your love for your children was fierce and true. You were painting a nursery for a daughter you would never get to raise. You are remembered. Peter, you were 3 years old, full of wonder and joy. The world was an adventure to you, every bug fascinating, every puddle an ocean. You never got to grow up, but you are remembered. And to the baby, the nameless girl who lived only moments, you existed, you drew breath. You were real, and you mattered. We don't have a name for you, but you are remembered. The Dardeen family story doesn't end with their deaths. It doesn't end with 36 years of silence. It ends with justice, with a courtroom, with a verdict that tells the world that no one gets away with murder forever, with a final chapter that honors their memory and condemns their killer. This is the ending they deserve, and we are witnessing it together. If this story has affected you, if it has moved you in some way, I ask you to share it. Not for me, for the Dardeens, for every family with an unsolved case, for every victim waiting for justice. Share this story as a reminder that evil does not win, that the truth has a way of emerging no matter how long it takes, that somewhere in a lab or a cold case unit or a genealogist's computer, the solution to the next case is waiting to be found. And if you know something about a crime, any crime, anywhere, please come forward. You might be the piece of the puzzle that has been missing. You might be the one who finally provides closure to a family that has waited too long. The Dardeens have their justice. Let's make sure others do too. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Thank you for being witnesses to the Dardeen family's tragedy and triumph. Thank you for remembering Keith, Elaine, Peter, and the baby. You are not forgotten.